Reign Over Me is a 2007 drama film starring Adam Sandler as a man consumed by grief after the loss of his wife and daughters from the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Five years after the attack, Sandler's character, Charlie Feynman, remains withdrawn and refuses to discuss the loss with anyone, choosing to bury his grief with distractions like music and video games. Throughout the movie, Charlie is seen playing Shadow of the Colossus, a video game developed by Sony Computer Entertainment's Japan studio. Reign Over Me was produced by Columbia Pictures, a division of Sony Pictures, but the game's inclusion wasn't intended as product placement or brand synergy. Shadow of the Colossus was brought to the film's director, Mike Binder, and to its star, Adam Sandler, by editor Jeremy Rausch. Rausch found parallels between the protagonists of the game and the film, who were both refusing to accept the death of their loved ones. As Jeremy Rausch put it in the 2007 Kotaku interview, quote, "You could see where someone who was dealing with 9/11 would be engrossed by a giant that keeps collapsing over and over again," unquote. In one scene of the film, Charlie takes turns playing the game with his friend Adam, played by Don Cheadle. Charlie's instructions as to how the controls worked were accurate and unscripted, as Adam Sandler and Don Cheadle were reportedly experts on the game when they arrived on set. This wasn't simply consummate professionalism by great actors. While the game's inclusion was for thematic reasons, Sandler himself had become a fan. Adam Sandler is just one of the countless people who have been impacted by Shadow of the Colossus, which is often hailed as one of the greatest games ever made, as well as one of the most influential. The game was developed by Team Ico, a development team within Sony's Japan studio. For nearly 30 years, Japan Studio helped shape not only the PlayStation's identity as a console, but the video game industry at large, originating iconic video game franchises such as Gran Turismo and Silent Hill, while also supporting more experimental projects with cult followings like Ape Escape and Gravity Rush. It was a studio founded and run on the idea of getting creative and unique talent and nurturing it to create exciting titles for the PlayStation ecosystem. Team Ico's output consisted of just 3 games across 15 years: Ico, Shadow of the Colossus, and The Last Guardian. Despite the small selection, the games they've influenced are too numerous to list and range from small indie titles like Journey to some of the most popular games of all time, like the Legend of Zelda franchise. Hidetaka Miyazaki, for example, will quit his high-paying job as an account manager for Oracle Corporation to become a game designer after playing Ico, joining From Software at the age of 29. He would go on to work closely with Japan Studio while directing Demon's Souls for the PlayStation 3 and Bloodborne for the PlayStation 4. Other larger Sony Computer Entertainment franchises such as God of War, Horizon, Uncharted, and even The Last of Us take mechanical, visual, and thematic inspiration from Team Ico's work. The developers of these games wore the influence on their sleeves, quite literally in the case of The Last of Us Part 1, which has unlockable Ico and Shadow of the Colossus t-shirts for the companion character Ellie. Shadow of the Colossus was a game that was successful by itself, but it also offered inspiration and guidance for Sony's larger, more financially successful projects. But of course, nothing gold can stay. And as technology became more and more complex and video game development demanded more resources, priorities shifted at Sony with each new console iteration. Output at Japan Studio lagged during the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 generation, with their inclination for smaller, more experimental games largely relegated to the handheld devices, the PlayStation Portable, and Vita. Attempts at more casual, traditionally marketable titles like Knack also proved to be a poor fit for the studio. Japan Studio became more and more of an anomaly as their parent company shifted priorities. Attempts to stand out got little support, and attempts to fit in weren't resonating with audiences. Over time, the incumbent talent that defined Japan Studio would leave it. Former members of Team Ico would go on to form an independent company called Gen Design in 2014, for example. And this would later inspire Silent Hill and Gravity Rush creator Keiichi Toyama to leave Sony in 2020 and start his own company, Boca Game Studio. He would also be joined by former Japan Studio employees. Bloodborne producers Masaki Yamigawa and Teruyuki Toriyama would also leave Japan Studio around this time. Employees at Japan Studio either left or their contracts were not renewed, and the studio was rendered defunct on April 1st, 2021. A cruel joke. One that symbolized Sony shifts away from experimental works to primarily focusing on larger, expensive AAA experiences while depending on third parties and independent developers to round out their game library. Experimentation has largely been outsourced. Perhaps this was an inevitability. The indie scene is much more vibrant and viable than it was in 2005 when Shadow of the Colossus was released, but it also speaks to a creative stifling and stagnation in the AAA space, one that comes from a corporation like Sony that continues to insist on bigger and bigger experiences as it becomes more and more expensive to do so. The pursuit of this has brought us to a point where we need to reckon with how sustainable this model is, because it looks more like we are inching closer and closer to creating a desolate wasteland occupied by nothing but giants, these Colossi, imposing mementos of a past where life once teemed, yet nothing beside remains. Large as these colossi may be, they're still fragile and can be easily toppled if they're not careful. They're hulking tragedies whose collapse would signify further tragedy. One single team survived a Japan studio after it was made defunct. Team Asobi, who just this year developed Astrobot, one of the year's most acclaimed titles and a celebration of the history of the PlayStation. It was made by a team of around 60 people over the course of 3 years. Compare that to another PS5 release, Concord, an historical failure for Sony that took 8 years to make, and whose low sales led to the game getting shut down in 2 weeks, shutting down on the same day that Astrobot launched. It's a cautionary tale, an expensive but important lesson that the video game industry still has time to learn from. What can we hope will grow if we don't plant seeds? What is an ecosystem without diversity? What identity do we have without a variety of experiences? How sustainable is this model if thousands get laid off every year in the pursuit of it? How much talent are we losing in the process? It is disappointing that it is up to the people with the least to make up for the mistakes made by the people with the most. But that is the cruel irony of life. When the balance is disrupted and the scales tip, the giants will have their moment. But it'll only be a moment before Goliath is felled by David. The AAA project outdone by a smaller studio. A Concord outdone by an Astrobot. There's a lesson we can learn here. Don't underestimate the little guy. Our short kings. I'm Keifer, and this is Select and Start. Hello, and welcome to Select and Start, the podcast about meaningful and memorable video games. I'm your host, Keifer, and every episode I bring on a guest who selects a game that made an impact on their life. I have a very exciting guest today. He is a video game industry veteran with over 20 years of experience under his belt, working on titles such as Metroid Prime 3, Fallout 3, 4, and 76, as well as the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. His new video game, The Axis Unseen, which he independently developed and published, will release on October 22nd. It is my honor to introduce Nate Purkeypile. Nate, how are you today?
Good. How about you?
Doing well, especially when I have such a wonderful guest to speak to. Really means a lot that you came on my little humble show here to talk about a massive, massive video game. We'll talk about that in a second here. I usually take a second to get to this, but you have such like this storied history with video games, and I want to sort of get to the root of that. As we know, no community likes to gatekeep more than video gamers. So we have to check your gaming credentials here at the top as a person who makes them. Let's talk a little bit about your gaming history. What got you into it? What was your relationship with it throughout the years? What is your portrait of a gamer?
Like, I had been into games ever since I was a kid. Like, literally in grade school, I was like, for some reason, they would let me program in the back of the class. So basically, I had stuck with it and kept making like mods for Half-Life, and then inevitably ended up in games after I went to college specifically for that. So it was kind of always what I was the most interested in. Like, I had other interests, like read a lot of books and played D&D, all the regular, nerdy kid stuff, but games was always like number one for me.
Well, you're in the right place to talk about that. You talked about like, going into like the career path of that and developing Half-Life mods. What were like your favorite games throughout your childhood?
I mean, I was big into like the first person shooters back then, like Doom and Quake, but also on the other side of the spectrum, I was really, really liked like Civilization and XCOM. I mean, we didn't really have like indie games back in those days, but I tried to play lots of different kinds of games and adventure games also. Like, I love Monkey Island.
Yeah. It sounds like the PC was kind of where you did a lot of your gaming. You mentioned making Half-Life mods yourself. Do you remember any notable mods of other people that you played, or were you just involved in that community in general?
I mean, we would help each other out a bit. So like I had my own, which was called Desert Crisis, which had very little to do with any crisis in an actual desert. It's more of like a sci-fi action game. But I also helped out on like Action Half-Life. But I mean, there was lots of great ones back then. I mean, like Team Fortress, but that started back in Quake. Like, I played the original Team Fortress for Quake. Like, it's a good thing I didn't have like my Steam hours counter on that, because it's got to be like 5,000 hours or something absurd.
Yeah, no, so you're an OG. You got to play like stuff that was like from the original Half-Life and playing the original Team Fortress Classic. I mean, that's credentials all on its own here. Now that we have a little bit of your background here, I want to know more about your history in video game development, because even now you're talking about that you worked on things like Desert Crisis and working with like modders and things of that nature. How did you start working in video games proper? What led you to the path of making your own indie game along that way?
So I got in my first like actual games job because I went to this college called DigiPen, and I did like an internship over the summer, but that was only for like a couple months at this place called Wild Tangent. But basically, when I was about to graduate, I applied to literally every game company I could find, which at the time was like 250 applications or something. And only two said yes, and it was Terminal Reality in Texas and then Ubisoft in Canada. And I don't like the cold, so I went to Texas, and that's how I got my first like real start making like actual big games. I mean, it's not like they were huge AAA things. It's still like a smaller studio, but definitely bigger than the stuff I worked on at Wild Tangent, which was like random card games and all sorts of stuff. Shipped like 20 things there, and I was only there a couple months.
Right. You said working at Terminal Reality, like that's a smaller studio, and this is like an earlier part of video game development. So you sort of witnessed things change from like shorter development cycles on smaller games into like larger development cycles on larger games. So after that, how did you sort of get into Bethesda from there?
Basically, because Terminal Reality was small and the games were like so. Like they were fine. I liked Bloodrayne 2 a lot, but it's not where a lot of people really wanted to end up. So a lot of people would go to Terminal Reality, get their first job there. Some really, really great people. And then they would go somewhere else. So from that studio, you have people at like Bungie and Valve and all these other places. But I had some friends who ended up at Bethesda. And I first applied to them because I had like 3 or 4 friends there at that point, and went through the interview process, but they were like really, really slow at hiring. So I was just like, I don't have time to wait for this. And I took a job at Retro Studios instead. But then eventually I decided I didn't really want to stay there working for Nintendo. They were very like top down with how they manage things. And I felt I was going to kind of get stuck there as an artist because, their tech is not the greatest. So it's not great for your portfolio. I basically like interviewed again at Bethesda, and I didn't even have to fly out or anything. They're like, "Oh, Purkeypile, we remember you," because it was only like a year and a half later.
Right. So this is how you go from working on things like Bloodrayne 2 to Metroid Prime, Metroid Prime 3 specifically, and then this leads you to working on the Fallout video games. Before going independent, because we talked about this when I introduced you, you worked on Fallout 3, 4, 76, Skyrim. Of the games when you were working for other people, what was your favorite that you worked on?
I mean, I think if I had to pick one, it would actually specifically be Point Lookout for Fallout 3, because I
Yeah.
was like the co-lead on that and lead artist, and like the tools were pretty stable at the time. Like we basically had no programmer support and like 4 months to just make something. And I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. Like to this day, a lot of people are like, "Oh, that's my favorite DLC." And there's some pretty like obvious parallels there with like Point Lookout and all the horror stuff there and Fallout 76 and me putting all the monsters in that. And now I'm making a horror game.
Yeah, I can totally track the lineage there. Do you think working on something like Point Lookout, which is using existing assets in Fallout 3, do you think would you say that reminded you of your Half-Life modding days?
Yeah, a little bit. It's nice to have like a solid foundation to build from so that you can spend more time doing like cool new stuff. Cause like when we were first making like Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, there is so much boring stuff you have to make, like forks and desk fans, even though that desk fan in Fallout 4 is like super famous now. But it's lots of small stuff versus these memorable things like the mansion explosion and Point Lookout, all that
Right.
sort of stuff.
Yeah, you have like this great existing pile of stuff that you can work on, so you can sort of create set pieces within that. That must feel really gratifying to work on. I also wanted to talk to you about going back a little bit because this is a game that never came out. You worked on the game within the movie Demonic, and I found this out because your trailer for the Axis Unseen is like, "Hey, you remember that game from Grandma's Boy?" And I was like, "I actually do, yes," because my friends and I watched that movie a lot on Comedy Central because we were millennials who went to college and Comedy Central was always on TV. This was at one point a real video game in development at Terminal Reality. Can you talk about the development of that game at all and why it got canceled?
I don't recall exactly why it got canceled because I was only on it for like a few months in between projects, but it was a real game, like you said, and like Clive Barker was going to be the writer, and I was like a huge Clive Barker fan. So I was really excited to work on it, and it seemed like it was going well, but I don't know. Publishers do publisher things, and I'm sure they had some reason for canceling it. It was fairly far along, but it's not like it was like almost done. But I am happy that it is in Grandma's Boy because so many people work in games for like 10 years sometimes and then like just nothing comes out. So,
Yeah.
plus it's kind of hilarious. It's like, oh, everyone's heard of Skyrim. Well, what about that dumb game in Grandma's Boy?
Yeah, it's so strange because it's a video game that doesn't technically exist, but is kind of encased in amber, preserved to be like the main plot point of a movie, uh, like a Happy Madison movie. So it's like, nobody really got to play this game except kind of, these characters in this fictional world. So it's just like this really fun lineage to leave behind where like you did sort of leave your mark in some way, and that is something tangible that you can show people like, hey, here's a Linda Cardellini playing my video game.
Yeah, it's definitely not what people would normally expect because people would assume it's a fake game because there is the other game in there, like the fighting game one, which is
Mhm.
fake. Like they took some Bloodrayne characters and like reskinned them and like made it look like a fighting game, but that wasn't really real. But yeah, Demonic wasn't made by one dude in his basement. It was like a whole team was making that game, and some marketing person made that thing happen, and now it's there.
Yeah, totally. Glad that it exists somehow, sort of. I want to talk a bit about your video game that you made, The Axis Unseen, which is this video game that's coming out on PC on October 22nd. The demo is out now as of the time of this recording. I got to play with it myself and had a good time with it. In your own words, tell us a bit about The Axis Unseen.
Yeah. So the Axis Unseen is a heavy metal horror game where you hunt monsters from folklore, and it's like a big open world. You can collect like sense powers of the creatures. So you can see sense particles, track them. It's closer to like a hunting simulator than it is like an action game. That said, if you want, you can play it all actiony and stab them in the face, but it is at its core has lots of simulation aspects going on behind it.
Yeah, I did certainly try to play it as an action game at one point. I sort of caught myself between the portal and just kept running out and then stabbing people and then running back to base, replenishing, running back out. Just get a funny loop there because I do enjoy stealth and survival aspects. So I did play around a little bit too, but I just like to test what can I do? And the answer is a lot. And this is very impressive for a solo developed project that you can accommodate different ways of play. What was the inspiration for you to leave? Because a lot of people get laid off in the video game industry, as we talk about a lot on the show, but you made the conscious choice to step away from a company like Bethesda to make your own video game. Like you have credits going back to Fallout 3 all the way to Starfield. What was the inspiration for you to go out on your own to create your own independently made project?
So I've always been playing like lots of indie games, and I like judge for the IGF every year and stuff. So it's always been something I really, really like. And then like Unreal 5 was coming out, and I noticed they have like all of these new things where open world games were way more possible. And they have like this technology called Nanite where you could basically throw unlimited geometry at the screen. And all of those things seemed really cool. And I was like, you know what? I've already worked on like 5 open world games. I really know what goes into making those. And honestly, like a hunting game seemed like an approachable design. It's like super scalable. It's not this dense urban environment full of thousands of props and NPCs with all different outfits. Like I played a lot of the Hunter Call of the Wild, and I was like, I could do that. so, so I decided to make the leap and go for it.
No, I mean, like, what a great leap, too, because this feels like a very specific labor of love. Talking a little bit about the development of that a little bit. Like you said, it's mostly solo developed. What did you do on your own, and what were the things that you brought on other people to assist with? Because even on these small independent projects, these things aren't made completely alone. There's feedback and testing and so much that goes into it.
So I got Clifford Meyer from the band ISIS to do the whole soundtrack because I wanted to use one of their songs and just like emailed their Bandcamp page, seeing if they licensed stuff, and mentioned I worked on Skyrim. And then he like offered to just do the soundtrack, and we got to chatting, and it worked out super well. Great guy.
Nice.
And then I got this person who did the bestiary for Fallout 76 that I really liked, where there was like all these drawings and journal entries. And I got them to do all my journal drawings because I wanted that kind of thing also, where you kill a monster and then it unlocks a journal entry and a drawing in this book that
Mhm.
you have. And then I got a series of writers to do all of the writing that you find out in the world from other people who came through, because I wanted it to feel like there's different voices for all these different people. That was like a really nice thing that you can just like kind of put off to the side and tell people about the world and be like, tell your story. Like it wasn't dictated by me at all. I was like, here's the stuff in it. What kind of story do you want to tell? But then, yeah, I did basically everything else with like the art and lighting and level design, systems, audio, marketing, the localization QA. I didn't do the localization myself. I got a company to do that. I got Ilya Nazarov, who was the lead concept artist on Starfield, to do the key art. As soon as he quit Bethesda, I was like, you've got to do key art for me.
I mean, that's really wonderful. I really especially like the detail of you bringing on writers to put their own little stories into the game or put their own voice into it, because it's like independence within independence. It feels like freedom is a big part of this design philosophy, because this is such a massive open world game. And I'm really impressed that, you're using this modern engine to create such a massive open world that you can sort of make into your own and survive within. Game development is not easy. It is magic to me as somebody who is a total outsider to it. What were the biggest challenges in solo developing, and what lessons did you learn along the way?
I mean, the biggest challenge is when you run into something that you just literally do not know how to handle. And sometimes that's terrifying, because normally in like a AAA setting, you just be like, I'm going to file a bug report and then wait a week or two and see what happens or whatever.
Yeah.
Like someone else will handle it. There's programmers. Like I hadn't programmed in like 20 years. So that was a little bit terrifying sometimes when stuff would break, but I was always able to get past it. So that was nice.
That does sound nice. Yeah. Like figuring things out on your own. It's sort of this thing where it's like, Google help. I don't know what to do. When
yeah.
I, as somebody who's like an audio and video editor, I just kind of have to I had to take like free class courses online to figure out some of the even most rudimentary things about this stuff. But it's really gratifying because you're making something that feels like your own. And that's leading to my next question, because being able to make something and seeing that end result is one of the most empowering feelings in the world. And that's why, despite me toiling away in the editing mines, I still make a podcast episode. And you made a whole video game. What were the greatest joys in the process of making this video game, and what are you most proud of?
I really like how the combat and enemies have turned out, because there's lots of different behaviors there. So I find the game fun, which is good. Like, honestly, that's not always the case, especially when things are super broken. So I always try to keep the game really stable. Like you mentioned playtesting a while back, and like that was something I tried to do kind of the whole time. I would have every week or two, I'd have someone new play the game and like see what worked and what didn't, and like keep tweaking things. And I kept the thing stable like the whole time, so that when I took it to shows and stuff, like it never crashed when I took it to a live show, even though people were playing it for like 3 days, doing all this weird stuff that I maybe never did. Like you never know what people are going to do when you play the game. Like as hard as you try to like, method test and pretend you're someone else and like, I'm going to play completely different. Sometimes you'll hand someone a controller and just be like, wait, you did what now?
Yeah, like human beings are inherently unpredictable, and the thing with like knowing the correct answer is you can never like be a new person developing something when you're playing through it. So I totally get that, even though I haven't experienced it. But yeah, like you are somebody that like made something of their own and put it out there in the world, and you had so much faith in making that project. And I'm really, really stoked to talk to somebody who made their own game. Of course, all art is not made in a vacuum. What were some inspirations that you drew from when making your own video game?
I think some of the biggest ones for when it comes to games is like, Shadow of the Colossus, for that like sense of mystery and the way the world is structured and like respect for the player, and Subnautica as well, because that has a lot of parallels there. Like when I played Subnautica, I was just like, I don't know, it's some diving survival game. But then you start playing it, like, oh my, this is crazy. The world like unfolds on itself, and I really, really liked that. But then there's like other media, like I really like there's this movie called The Ritual, and I just love the way it treats folklore, and so those are the biggest ones probably.
Yeah, I can definitely feel the Shadow of the Colossus on it in terms of the scale and the world, and how isolating it can be despite these massive things being around. And with Subnautica, like that's a game I've watched people play. I have it and I've been meaning to play it forever, but I just haven't gotten to it yet. But I can also just sort of feel that in like how the world is sort of communicating with you through its resources. So I really enjoy, and I do like the movie The Ritual as well. So I mean, like I definitely see all of this in here, and I'm really glad that we share a lot of taste, because that's explaining why I probably like your game so much. It's interesting because like it's like, oh, I can tell a Skyrim person worked on this game because this feels like a game made for people who played Stealth Archer in Skyrim.
Yeah, I hear that one a lot. Was not
Put it on the
necessarily
box.
on purpose, but I just always liked bows and games. I don't know. They're always super fun to me. People are like,
Yeah.
why didn't you make it with a gun? It's like, guns are so straightforward. It's like, if you had the cursor over them, you're going to hit. But the bow, it has like this inherent tension in it. It's like having to adjust for your shot, and you might then miss because it had moved. So.
Mm-hmm. No, it feels tactile. There's like something so impersonal about guns in video games, but like with a bow and arrow, there's like this, like there's tactility to it. And I really like the way that you've incorporated the user interface onto the quiver. Sorry, not the quiver, the bow. So you're actually able to see things in an immersive way and have a closer relationship with this thing that you're using to also, take things down. It is both like the thing that's keeping you alive and the thing that is also helping you take things down. I just really like that. So this is a question for me more than anything. Have you considered sending this game to John Carpenter, because he's a huge Fallout 76 fan, and I think this seems supremely his shit?
I mean, I have, because I am like keenly aware of the fact that he loves 76, and that just like made me go all fanboy when I heard that. I was like, John Carpenter likes something I worked on. I was very happy to hear that.
Yeah. I'm sure he would like this game if you sent it to him. It seems like, again, like it's a heavy metal video game.
It's worth a shot. I mean, that's like my whole marketing strategy. People ask me what my strategy is. I'm like, I'll try anything.
Yeah.
You never know what will work or who will say yes. Like, people ask me how I got it on IGN. I was like,
you guys like video games? Oh, shit. Yeah, we do. It's like, here you go. Okay, let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Look, I appreciate you putting yourself out there, because that can be like one of the most frustrating, not frustrating, but it's like it's the most annoying part of anything, is like you can make something, but you have to like sort of lead people to it, and putting yourself out there is the way to do it. And you seem to be doing a really good job of that. So I'm happy for you.
Thanks.
Going out a little bit, like you are somebody who makes video games and have been making video games for so long. How does that affect playing other people's video games for you? How conscious are you of like, having development brain while you're playing them?
I would say very conscious, and it can make it hard to enjoy any game that's not like really, really good. But I've made myself have a 15-minute rule where I'm not going to put a game down before 15 minutes, because it's really hard to just like, man, you can like already see the design. Like, honestly, I play almost no Metroidvanias anymore, because like I worked on a Metroid game. So I start playing those games, and I just see the systems. Like, okay, you get the thing to unlock that other region, and it can be really hard to get immersed. And that's part of why I did the whole, like, all the UI elements in my game are in world, because I just wanted to do as much as possible to make it about playing the game. And so many games feel like you're playing the menus, and you're just like constantly opening up all these inventories and like opening up your map every 5 seconds, or following the mini map and just staring at that in the corner. So I really wanted to bring people into it to try and minimize that.
Right. Like it's almost designed by subtraction, to borrow a term from Team Eco, where it's like the less it feels like you're playing a video game, the better the video game can be for a lot of people, because you don't have to just constantly play the menu game. And hey, menus are good in certain contexts. I love an RPG, but I'm just saying, like,
it doesn't always have to be that way.
Yeah, a video game can be anything. That's what I like about them. Talking about games that override that designer brain a little bit, what are the standout video games to you that you've played over the past few years that like really stand out to you?
I mean, I really, really liked The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2. The way their combat works and all the little touches. Sometimes you play games and, like you said, you just like see it as a game developer and you're just like, I don't know. And you see the design. But sometimes you play a game like that and you're just like, this is nuts. Like, this was so much work. It is absurd.
Yeah.
And you could just like appreciate it even more because you know how much all of those things took to actually pull off.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, again, I'm just a person that plays video games and talks about them into a mic every couple of weeks. And having that brain is kind of like a thing where it's like, oh, I can almost see the Matrix, but you actually do see the Matrix because you see these things like at the base level and make them into something and shape them into something. So I can only imagine the number of obstacles you have to go through to appreciate a game. Are there any others besides The Last of Us games that you can think of off the top of your head?
Let me see. I played a lot of Cyberpunk also. Like, I didn't play it right away, but I played it like a year after launch, and then I played that new DLC that came out recently. And
Yeah.
I thought that was like super well done, and I had a lot of fun with it. And it ran at like 30 FPS on my Steam Deck, which is wild. Like, that thing is so cool.
It is. I've been wanting one so bad. I'm like wanting to like play games for the show, and I just want to like be able to take some stuff with me because I have this aversion to the computer. So it's like I have this massive Steam library, and it's like I don't want to use my work machine to also play video games because it feels so So I just so
Yeah,
badly want handheld.
it is really nice to have that disconnect. And like, if the deck doesn't happen to run it well, you can always like stream from your computer. So
hmm
it's handy.
Yeah, I'd love to plug that thing into my TV and just couch it. But yeah, no, thank you for talking to me about your video game. That is, a video game is a part of you and your relationship with art, and that's going to lead us to talk about Shadow of the Colossus in a moment here. But before we get into Shadow of the Colossus, you mentioned Subnautica as a game that means a lot to you. What are some other core influences to you in the games that mean the most to you besides Shadow of the Colossus?
I think another one is Half-Life, actually. That was always a game that like really pushed the medium forward, and just like their approach to environmental storytelling at the time. Like, you go back and like, it's obviously been a while, but at the time that was just like a groundbreaking game, and nothing really felt the same way. And they did a lot of those cool things too. Like, instead of cutscenes, you're gonna let the player play it. And I always really liked that idea. And that's part of why also my intro is kind of like that, but also like this indie game called 30 Flights of Loving by Brendan Chung. And that game used cuts, which I really liked. Like, most games are linear. You're just like playing it the whole time in one cohesive timeline, but that one would have cuts forward in time or like switching between characters. And I really like that. So that's why I had the idea to have like a heavy metal intro where the whole thing was playable. It's not a cutscene like Half-Life. I wanted to keep the player in there. But then as the music goes, it cuts and teleports the player around and like introduces you to all these mechanics. Because, I mentioned really liking Cyberpunk, but I
Mm-hmm.
hate the kind of tutorial that Cyberpunk has that most AAA games have, where it goes on for like an hour, sometimes 2 or 3. And it just takes so long to actually get in the game. And it kind of feels like they're treating you like a child. Like, I get it. It's some people's first video game. But if it's not your first video game, you can just be like, oh, get on with it.
Yeah, I have this habit of creating a save state after a tutorial ends, so I don't have to go back every single time I replay it. I have to do that with The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess because as much as I like that game, that's like a 2-hour long tutorial where you're just talking to people.
Yeah, it's wild. Like, can you imagine if movies were like, hey, before you watch this movie, we're going to have to sit you down.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's painful.
Yeah, it's just the whole thing's like, here's how you watch a movie. And it's like, I've done this before, and it's like, it's nice to know the specifics, but like, can this be optional? But I really like the way that you do it because it feels like a montage. It's like almost a music video of a tutorial that just gets you in there, and then it becomes the event. I just really appreciate and admire that simplicity in a thing that where systems have become so complicated in modern video games.
And I think it works better than some people might expect. Like, I watched a whole bunch of people play that at shows, like hundreds now, really. And I think you would assume like, oh, it's cutting all the time. People might have trouble reading it. But actually, like, everyone was actually doing the right stuff. So I think there's something to be said for like more of a trial by fire, high pressure situation where that kind of stuff can actually sink in a little bit faster even.
Right, especially because this is a survival game and you're trying to use all the tools like all the tools at your disposal to stay alive. And then if you're reinforcing that through actual danger instead of through safety, it goes into your head better. I totally agree. Going back, you mentioned Subnautica or Shadow of the Colossus as one of the two games you would love to talk about, and I just want to make sure you have enough time to shout out Subnautica before we get into it. What about Subnautica do you really love?
I really like the structure of Subnautica from like an open world perspective. Like,
Hmm.
obviously I'd worked on lots of open world games, but the way Subnautica is structured is closer to something like Elden Ring and stuff, where you don't even know how big the map is at first. And I really like that feeling. Because you play Zelda, you play Skyrim and stuff, and it's just like, I'm gonna walk that way. You just like pick a random direction. It almost doesn't really matter. It's not even really a structured world. And I think there's a lot of benefit to like having this really handcrafted, bespoke thing where all of those reveals and stuff are very controlled, and it's almost like a wide level design instead of open, where
Hmm.
having that control offers a lot of benefits. And I like that sense of mystery that has.
Yeah, there's agency in a sort of controlled environment where it's like we're empowering the player through exploration, but we're not like overwhelming them outright by just saying, okay, go wherever. Bye. See ya.
And because so many other games you'll play, it'll be like, you have conquered 0 out of 18 of the regions or whatever. And you're like, well, I guess there's 18. Like, you just immediately, again, like, see the design of the game. You see the scope right away. You don't feel like you're in this world adventuring. You feel like you're having this checklist of chores to do. And I really don't like that feeling.
Yeah, like, I love the mystery. I want to see this thing reveal itself to me and like show itself to me. I want to see intention. I don't want to have the game spoiled for me because I accidentally opened up like the achievement menu or opened up like the map and saw exactly how big it is.
Yeah, like that just kind of ruins it for me. And even some stuff that's kind of like that in my game, I again tried to do in world. Like, you can kill all the creatures, and when you kill it, you get the journal entry and a story, but also a statue. And so there's like these empty pedestals in this safe area in between where you like heal and restock, and then slowly you just see it filling up the statue. So you're like, I see that really big one over there. Like, does that mean there's something that big?
Yeah.
But it's not like a bar that just fills in a menu. It's a thing in the world, and it feels like really tactile and more meaningful to me that way.
Yeah.
And I'm not showing them all either. There's whole other regions that I just don't even show yet.
Yeah. I like that approach because it's like you're using your logic in the world of the game to reach conclusions, whereas the opposite approach is sort of like a person. Like, basically, so many games almost give you their own in-game walkthrough, so you don't and it's just like this thing was like, well, I mean, at least make the person look up a guide if they want to be so literal about their experience, but I don't want to be mean to anybody. People like what they like. So thank you for telling me about, your video game and the video games that mean the world to you. Let's dedicate the rest of the episode to the game that means the most to you, and a game that I consider one of my favorites as well, a monumental totem in the video game industry, Shadow of the Colossus. Shadow of the Colossus is an action-adventure game published by Sony Computer Entertainment. It was developed by Team Ico, a first-party development team that was part of Sony Computer Entertainment's Japan studio, known at the time as Sony Computer Entertainment Japan, and now known as nothing, because Sony rendered it defunct in 2021 after the studio was reorganized and merged with Sony's other first-party developers. So it goes. Team Ico was led by Fumito Ueda, who served as the game designer and director of all 3 games developed by the studio: Ico, released in 2001, Shadow of the Colossus, and 2016's The Last Guardian. While all 3 games share a similar art style and are all action-adventure games with puzzle elements, they are distinct games with different gameplay. Of course, a game as monumental as Shadow of the Colossus was not done by a single person. Team Ico had a development team of 35 people to realize this vision, as well as support from their publisher that gave them more funding, creative freedom, and time than they had when they were making Ico. Producer Kenji Kaido worked closely with Ueda and the rest of the staff to assist them in the multiple challenges that arose during development. Ueda is known as a perfectionist and had a hands-on role in nearly every aspect of development. This reportedly earned him a lot of respect among the staff, but also challenged their morale, as he was known for making demanding requests and revisions. Character design was done by Shunpei Suzuki and Hitoshi Niwa. 48 colossi were originally planned in early development stages, reduced to 24, and finally 16, out of concerns that the game's quality would suffer if they did not rein in their ambition. The game features no enemy encounters outside of these colossi battles. It is a very lonely and isolating experience, and deliberately so. Ueda was hugely influenced by The Legend of Zelda since he was a child and wanted each boss battle to feel like, quote, inverted Zelda dungeons, unquote. Another childhood fascination of Ueda was monster films, which is what led to the large scale of the creatures and the world. To that end, Shadow of the Colossus' music was composed by Ko Otani, who also composed the Heisei era of Gamera films, as well as the 2001 Godzilla film GMK Giant Monsters All Out Attack. The staff worked closely with Otani to help create tracks that evoked different feelings and moods. Music is mostly only heard during cutscenes or colossi encounters. The restrained use of music helped to emphasize the isolating, lonely feeling of the world. Koji Hasegawa was the game's environmental designer. The process of building the world started by visualizing each Colossus layer and then creating the intermediary areas that led the player to these layers. Director Ueda urged Hasegawa and his team to accentuate the, quote, brightness and saturation of the textures, unquote, which led to scenery graphics being reworked multiple times during development. A December 2005 interview with the developers talked about how desaturated colors, motion blur, simulated high dynamic range rendering, and heavy bloom lighting were all used in the game's engine in order to achieve the desired atmosphere. Ueda also wanted an experience that did not rely heavily on dialogue, wanting a contemplative experience where the environment could communicate aspects of the world to the player. The game's script was written by 3 people, Junichi Hosono, Masashi Kudo, and Takashi Izutani. The game's story, much like the Forbidden Lands, is both immense and sparse. Your player character is Wander, a young man traveling to a vast and empty peninsula called the Forbidden Land. Accompanying him are his loyal steed, Argo, and the corpse of his loved one, Mano, who he is determined to resurrect after she was ritually sacrificed for having a cursed fate. After a long journey, Wander and Agro arrive at the shrine of worship where he brings Mano's corpse to an altar. Humanoid shadow creatures appear before him, but Wander dispatches them after waving his ancient sword at them. A pair of disembodied voices, a man and a woman, then speak out to Wander, introducing themselves as Dorman. After Wander explains that he has entered the Forbidden Lands to resurrect Mano, the voices tell him that they have the power to return her soul to her body, on the condition that Wander destroys the 16 idols in the temple. The only way this is possible is for him to use his ancient weapon to slay the 16 colossi scattered throughout the Forbidden Land. Dorman also explains that a great personal price must be paid to pursue this goal, but Wander is undeterred, and sets out with Argo to slay the 16 colossi. He raises his sword by the light and heads to the place where the sword's light gathers. Shenanigans ensue. Shadow of the Colossus was released on the PlayStation 2 in October of 2005. Other games released in 2005 include Burnout Revenge, Dragon Quest VIII, God of War, Guitar Hero, The Legend of Zelda, The Minish Cap, Psychonauts, Sly 3 Honor Among Thieves, and 4 games I previously covered on the show, Resident Evil 4, which I covered with Eric Peacock from Soundtracker, Pokemon Emerald, which I covered with my best friend Avi Robin Odd, who did the art for the show, Star Wars Battlefront 2 with Caroline Thompson from How Have You Not Seen, and Rockstar's The Warrior, which I did with Roman Fruhan. This is the 5th game from 2005 I've done an episode on. It remains to date the most covered on the show. Really quickly, Nate, did you play any of these games I just threw out there?
I mean, yeah, like especially Resident Evil 4. That is probably one of my most replayed games of all time.
It's a great one. Did you play the remake?
I've played like all the remakes, and I played it in VR twice, both versions.
Yeah.
So I'm a big Resident Evil fan. And I feel like everybody played Guitar Hero back then.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, 2005, big year for a lot of people on this show, yourself included. But of all the games in the world that you love, you mentioned Shadow of the Colossus, the one that you wanted to talk about. What made you want to talk about Shadow of the Colossus out of all games?
I think it's just like such a singular and unique game, but also probably the one that is the closest to mine in a whole bunch of ways. Like all the architecture in the game is similar and a lot of the themes. So there's certainly a lot of parallels there. And it's definitely has been on my mind when working on the game.
Absolutely. I mean, this is one of a kind. When I played this game, it was well after it had come out, and it just still felt like a singular thing. Obviously, I'd played games that were influenced by it, but even after that, it still just felt like this is its own game. Nothing has ever replicated it perfectly, and it really can't be because of the unique vision and intention and things behind it. People can really only take ideas from that, and that feels pure because it's this thing where it's like this thing exists in so many different forms and packages after it, and it still feels like itself. So let's go back in time a bit. What was your first encounter with this game?
I played it close to when it released. I don't think it was like day one or anything, but close to it. And I just got like completely sucked into it and absolutely loved it. And yeah, it like stuck with me ever since. I've played thousands of games, and some of them, honestly, you just kind of like forget about. Even if you beat it, it's like not that notable, and it like fits into the trappings of the genre in so many ways that it's not really bringing anything new to the table. But that is definitely not the case with that game.
Absolutely. I mean, there are games where it's like, oh, I platinum that, and then there are games where I can remember exactly being like exactly 18 years old when I first played Shadow of the Colossus on the PlayStation 3, and I can remember like what it felt like hearing certain music cues for the first time and having conversations with people about this game and trying to get them to play it. this is just a game that you just want to spread as far and wide as possible, even though like I myself was somebody who was late to it. And it's just, it just occupies the mind. Do you remember how you heard about it the first time?
I think somebody that I worked with told me about the game, if I remember right. Yeah. That was after I got out of college.
So you were already working in video games at this point in time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Because this feels like, I mean, I think, reading your rap sheet, so to speak, like you've been in video game development for about 20 years. This game, it just turned 19 years old.
Yeah.
Like, what a game to like sort of define like your career from an early point. Am I right?
Yeah. Because, yeah, Bloodrayne 2, that shipped on the PS2 also. It was like Xbox and PS2. So that was the first era of me putting out games.
Yeah. Wow. And it definitely feels like a developer's video game as much as it also feels like a game that everybody can love. This is just something that especially just resonated with people who know how video games work, because even they're like, oh my God, how did they do this? There's nothing like this out there.
Yeah. Like the animation to this day holds up. It's so much more natural than most things were at the time. It was incredibly impressive. Even if the game had like frame rate issues, what they were trying to do in that game at the time, it was so impressive that like, I can live with 20 FPS or maybe sometimes lower because it's so cool.
Totally. As a developer yourself, can you like comment on any of like the choices that they made at the time and like how they resonated with you?
The whole climbing mechanics were so cool because like nowadays, like everybody has climbing, but honestly, it's like pretty inconsequential and I kind of hate it. It's like, oh, look, I'm climbing. This thing crumbled and it fell. And it doesn't really matter. But in this game, it's like all tied into how that game works. And it really does matter. And you really do feel like you're like wrestling against this giant. And it was just such like this cool, unique thing that I hadn't seen. Normally, it's like, oh, I'm just going to sit there, swing my sword. It's going to do a big attack. I'll dodge the attack. But no, in this game, you're like, I'm climbing on that thing. It kind of blew my mind.
Yeah. Things like climbing are so standard of video games now, and like this game being so influential that like it's easy for it sometimes to get lost in the sauce of like what mechanically it introduced in addition to just like the aesthetic and theme and vibes and atmosphere. But like this game's influence like goes as far as like Ueda was a person who was influenced by Zelda, and Zelda has now been influenced by Ueda and Team Ico and Shadow of the Colossus, and incorporating the climbing and the melancholy quiet world into Breath of the Wild. And it's this thing where it's like
it's like the exact same stamina bar, right?
Kinda, yeah, like it's circular.
Yeah.
It's just like this symbiotic relationship that is also like this thing was like, why didn't I think of that? Why aren't we doing that? Like now in the era of like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and like these computers that can basically like fire missiles from like desktops, we see things be gigantic in games and like climbing massive objects that take up so many polygons. And even then, it feels much more scripted than it did when Team Ico was creating like these autonomous giant creatures that you have to climb at 15 frames a second on the PlayStation 2. It still feels ahead of its time, even as people are literally copying its homework.
Yeah, you're not like going along the yellow painted ledges in that game.
I'm a person that likes Horizon Zero Dawn. I'm a person that loves Breath of the Wild. I think that it is among my favorite games ever. I'm not dissing games that are influenced by it because you can't topple the king or whatever. But it is just like this thing where I did a lot of research on this episode and I saw a lot of people trying to make bad faith arguments on Reddit posts or whatever, saying, I think this game aged poorly or this game's controls suck, because it just makes me sad that a lot of people don't see intention or really try and engage with the game beyond its controls. People say like, oh, like the game is fun, but, or I don't like the way the horse controls. And we'll get into stuff like that later on. I don't want to like give the whole game away from the jump, but it is just this thing where it's like, yeah, people took those mechanics into more commercial places, like dealing with giant objects and overcoming insurmountable goals, being a tiny thing against a big thing, just climbing in general. But this is a game that's doing so much more than just grabbing onto something and slaughtering it. It is so much more than the sum of its parts.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you're right about like intention with controls there. And that is very true with like Resident Evil as well, where people would sometimes complain about like the tank controls and how it's so horrible. But that was another case, in my opinion, of the intention behind that controls is to have that be that way, and how it is like kind of terrifying dealing with the zombies in those games. And I mentioned that I played those games in VR, and that was really fun. But oh, it is so much easier. Just like headshot, headshot. It's more like a John Wick zombie simulator.
Yeah. It becomes a power fantasy very quickly. And I think that a lot of gamers just do not know how to reckon with things that aren't power fantasies in video games.
Yes.
I wanted to talk about this when you mentioned Half-Life. There's that contemplative intro that's like doing environmental storytelling and getting you used to the architecture and layout of Black Mesa. And then it slowly dawns on you, the player, that everything I saw is something I'm actually going to move through in the game. Whereas like at the time, people are probably more used to Doom, where it's just like, boom, level 1, get out there, kill as much as possible, slaughter, 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 which isn't to say that Half-Life invented narrative in the first person space or anything like that. But just like to the layman, that alone would have been like a mind-blowing new approach. And it's like this thing was like, why are we doing this? And then now what Half-Life did has become like so standard in video game storytelling that we almost take that for granted. All art is basically people fighting with limitation in some way. I'm sure when you were developing Axis Unseen, you were like, here are my abilities and here's what I can do in this space. And while opportunities are limitless, I am still a person dealing with my own ability. And the people who are making Shadow of the Colossus were absolutely reckoning with their own limitations. They wanted to do so many Colossi, and they arrived at 16, and ultimately that became the best choice. Ambition and then the outcome. I do think that this game is basically perfect, and I just get so protective over it.
Yeah, I think it's easy to assume that you could just add more and more, and it doesn't necessarily make a game better. Like, I don't think I would want Shadow of the Colossus with, like, what if I was fighting monsters the whole time to get there and could grind for gear? Like, I'm so sick of grinding for gear.
Yeah. Is that something that you were, like, very conscious about when you were developing the Axis Unseen and, like, how you want to handle accumulating power, so to speak, in your world?
Yeah, that's actually a huge deal for me. Like, I totally get it, and it's great for those games like MMOs and Diablo, and that works well for them, but I like the way it feels in like Shadow of the Colossus and Half-Life and Resident Evil, where all of these unlocks that you get in those games are what I refer to as like chunky. It feels like I got this thing that really matters. You're not like, I got 2.5% increased damage against like this one kind of creature or whatever. So many upgrades in so many games are so minuscule. Or it's like this random roll where you're going to have to do it 1,000 times to get something that's not garbage. But I just want to be like, no, I found something. It's cool. It's better. You can really feel that feeling, and I like that.
Me too. And I want to talk more about this game in depth with you in a moment, but every episode I do a little segment where I talk about how people can play the game we're discussing in a segment called No Country for Old Games. So before we talk more about this very important game to both of us, Nate, I do want to talk about how readily available it is. So people who are interested in playing it can check it out, because video game preservation is one of the things that means the most to me. If there is any video game in the world that you can argue is art and makes a case that it is an artistic medium, look no further than Shadow of the Colossus. It's that game. It is that game. Video games being an art form means that we should be preserving them, but that doesn't mean as much to the publishers, who will historically struggle with keeping older things on modern hardware because this is a business, this is commercial. So as time goes on, games that were once readily available become more and more difficult to acquire. So we are going to rate today's game on a scale of A to ARG, and ARG is me being frustrated at how hard it is to acquire this game, and not me covertly advocating for piracy. Piracy is illegal. It is a bad thing to do. But this is also a game about moral complexity, so who's to say what's really good or bad? Shadow of the Colossus originally released on October 18th, 2005 in North America, October 27th in Japan. That's almost exactly 19 years ago. Wow. Yeah. All right. The PAL version released in February of 2006. Aging is a good thing. It is good to get older. Those who pre-ordered the game in Japan received a limited release version of the game with different packaging, as well as promotional videos shown at exclusive events and production footage from the early prototype of the game when it was known as Nico. These promotional videos, if you can find them anywhere, are very illuminating about the development of video games. Games are not made in a vacuum, as we have rigorously gone over in this episode. Have you ever watched any like the production videos around Shadow of the Colossus?
I haven't actually.
Yeah, would be worthwhile. I get a lot out of it. But this also featured unpublished screenshots, storyboards, and videos throughout the game's development. The version of the game released in PAL regions came in cardboard packaging with artwork from the game. 4 art cards were also included, and a making of documentary, a concept art gallery, and a trailer for their previous game, Eco, was included and accessible from the main menu. You got this game in America? Fuck you. No bonus materials, but hey, at least you got the best game ever made or whatever. Shadow of the Colossus was a PS2 exclusive, meaning it was not planned for release on other consoles. But in September of 2011, Sony Computer Entertainment published the Eco and Shadow of the Colossus collection for the PlayStation 3. This port was developed by Bluepoint Games with staff from Team Eco assisting in the process. These versions of the game were HD remasters that supported high-definition displays up to 1080p. Both games in the collection played a fixed 30 FPS. The PS2 version of Shadow of the Colossus would frequently experience frame rate dips, as we discussed before. So it was actually a very big deal that Shadow of the Colossus ran at a stable 30. I was reading like the Digital Foundry article that was released in 2011, and there was like a quiet like, it is a bummer that it isn't higher, but thank God it's normal. Stereoscopic 3D and 7.1 surround sound support were added to the collection. Remember 3D?
Totally forgot that had that.
Bonus video material for both games and the then unreleased The Last Guardian were also included in the collection, as were 2 dynamic themes for the PS3's cross-media bar. Remember the cross-media bar? Ueda and Team Eco considered including cut Colossi in the collection, but opted to stay, quote, faithful to the base work. The collection was sold both physically and digitally. Notably, the Japanese release sold the remastered versions of Eco and Shadow of the Colossus separately, though some retailers sold a box collection that included both games. If you own a PS3 and have an internet connection, you can still purchase and download the HD version of Shadow of the Colossus to this very day, separately for $9.99 even. You either have to add funds to your wallet on the PlayStation Store or basically any other device except your PlayStation 3 to do so, including your mobile phone. If you log on a PS4, a PS5, or your phone, you can add funds to your wallet and buy it on the PlayStation 3. You cannot use your credit card on the PlayStation 3. I'm not going on a rant about it. Anyway, you have to make a deal with a wizard and you can buy Shadow of the Colossus HD on the PlayStation 3 if you still own one. On the PlayStation 4, Bluepoint Games returned to develop not a remaster, but a remake, a ground-up remake of Shadow of the Colossus. Published in February of 2018 by Sony Interactive Entertainment, the game is nearly identical, built off the codebase of the PS2 version, but with new ultra-high-def art assets, a new optional control scheme with quote-unquote modern controls. On a PS4 Pro or PS5, the game can run at a 140/40p resolution at 30 FPS or 1080p at 60 FPS. New features include New Game Plus, Easy Mode, Mirrored World version, a photo mode, a new optional collectible, coins, which can unlock a new sword if all are collected. Lighting and filter changes are included and are optional. The HUD has been tweaked. I don't want to spend too much time on all the new features and differences. The Team Eco wiki on fandom.com will go into in depth on all those differences if you're so curious about them. But let's just talk about how we play this game. I usually play this game, and I originally played it on the PlayStation 3, the HD release that Bluepoint co-developed with Eco. Before this episode, I did play the PS4 version for the first time because it was free with my PlayStation Plus subscription. Nate, how do you play this game?
I had most recently played that PS4 one.
How did you feel about it?
It seemed really cool to me. Like, it was nice playing it weirdly smooth, honestly. So, and I thought they did a great job with the art and everything. So it's very, very clear the way that they've approached those has been very faithful to it and not ruining it in some weird way or something. And they look really nice.
Yeah. Bluepoint were very passionate about this game. They worked on the remaster, so they had experience with it. And a lot of the people on staff said it was in their top 5 games of all time. So it does read as a labor of love when you play it. And the gameplay is intact. And you can still play with the classic controls if that means a lot to you. And it did to me. I thought that the new controls actually felt weird and made the game too easy. Do you have the PlayStation 2 version still, or did you ever play the PS3 version?
I never played the PS3 one, but I do still have my PS2 one. I definitely am one of those people that keeps all of my old games and have all the old consoles all plugged in and stuff.
Yeah, not to dox you, but in the background, I see like your games that you developed on your shelf here. I see Bloodrayne 2 on there. I see Metroid Prime 3 on Wii. Yeah, it's all there, and it looks great.
Yeah, and then I have the whole other shelf of all the other games to play that it's all like alphabetized by platform.
Yeah, I'm jealous. So there's discourse about this, and to wait on it a little bit, I personally much prefer the visuals and atmosphere of the PS3 and PS2 version. I would never accuse someone who has only played the PS4 version of not having truly played the game, though. You picked this game to talk about. You're a video game developer. You know about intention and art direction and things like that, and you don't seem to mind the PS4 version.
No, I mean, I understand if people want to be purist about it, but I thought they did a great job, and I really do like the art, so I was happy with it.
Yeah. Playing the PS4 version didn't make me angry. I'm not saying that. I don't think Blue Point ruined the game. It is a clear labor of love. I disagree with like things like adding a coin collectible in there just because it just feels a little too gamey, and it feels like a game that was trying to avoid being like other games in that way. Even though I have a preference, and this is what I'm trying to get at here, I can understand where people are coming from when they do get frustrated that the Blue Point version is the one that they can play if they have a PlayStation 4 or 5, and they can't really play the PS3 version unless you own a PS3, or you can't play the PS2 version unless you own a PS2. And that's where it sticks with me. I'm not mad at Blue Point. More power to them to have their own take and interpretation of the game and the remake, which again was a labor of love. But I do wish there was a way for people to just play Team Eco's original vision, which felt so deliberate. And I spent so much time in the intro talking about like what they did to make that atmosphere.
That's one of the nice things about hardware becoming more standardized these days, because back in like the PS2 and PS3 days, it was so much more custom. Like working on Skyrim, the Xbox one, like that's more or less a computer, but like the PS3 one, that thing is weird and so hard to get anything from that to a PC. It's just so completely different. But I think that will make future game preservation easier, basically, because it's not a bunch of like these weird ultra custom boxes.
Yeah.
They're basically computers. Like I know there's a little bit more to it than that, but really a lot of it is UI layers on top of regular computer stuff.
Yeah, this has become a very accessory-driven industry, especially with the proliferation of VR technology. Like the big selling point of the PlayStation 5 is the DualSense as much as the actual console is a selling point.
Yeah, and I do like that controller. That's a nice controller. The triggers are like super cool, actually.
I love it. It's like one of my favorite controllers if I had to like think about it. But this is a thing to consider with porting things forward, is also like how unique architecture is with these things. Like if you play a Hideo Kojima game, that's a guy who's like taking apart the PlayStation and seeing what's inside and then using every aspect of it, which is going to make porting Metal Gear Solid 4 one day a huge pain in the ass. And it's why we can't play it on anything but a PlayStation 3.
Hold it, Snake. Time to change the disc. I know, it's a pain. But you need to swap disc 1 for disc 2. You see the disc labeled 2?
No.
Huh? Oh, wait. We're on PlayStation 3. It's a Blu-ray disc. Dual layered, too. No need to swap.
Damn it, Otacon! Get a grip!
Yeah, what an age we live in, huh, Snake? Wonder what they'll think of next.
Long story short, I can understand like I'm doing light critique of the Blue Point version of the game, and I'm trying not to. And it's not because I dislike Blue Point or disagree with their philosophy, but I am frustrated that their version is the only one that gets to live on and go to other consoles after Sony shuttered Japan's studio. And it just feels disrespectful in a way on the publisher side that the most convenient way to play games like Shadow of the Colossus and Demon's Souls is through the remakes, while the originals have been neglected in the studio that originally made these highly influential medium-defining games are gone. I just hate that part. So if we're rating this game, I'm not going to give it an ARG because people can still play Shadow of the Colossus and still be moved and affected and influenced. But it doesn't feel like an A either. And this is something that Sony really needs to be better about, instead of trying to think about their internal philosophy of like locking things behind either having a lot of money or everything being a money-driven experience. It just for one moment ever think about the actual artistry of the thing. This is a game that had a profound impact on both developers and the audience of both gamer and developer, present company included. This is a game that sold so well. A Greatest Hits titles version was released on August 6, 2006, less than a year after the game's original release. The PlayStation 2 version of the game holds a 91 out of 100 on the review aggregation website Metacritic. It is often touted as one of the greatest games ever made. It won so many awards when it was released in 2005. This game was basically immediately labeled a classic, a staple, a genre and medium-defining game. But we're not here to reduce this legacy to sales figures and greatest hits labels, review scores. We're here to talk about this game's impact on the people who played it. So let's get into that, Nate.
Need a new campaign idea for your tabletop role-playing game?
Looking to improve your GMing skills or become a better player?
Curious about exploring the origins of your favorite races, classes, and creatures?
Then check out the Maniculum podcast, where we show you how to use medieval history to your advantage. We're your hosts, Mac and Zoe, a professional medievalist and a AAA game developer, and together we use modern game design techniques to uncover the origins of your favorite tropes and adventures from medieval manuscripts. In each episode, we explore a new medieval manuscript, its connections to modern TTRPGs, and teach you how to adapt these tales into compelling campaigns and amazing adventures.
Whether you're looking to recreate the noble Arthurian tales or incorporate weird and wacky medieval monsters into your campaign, the Maniculum podcast has you covered.
Listen to our fortnightly podcast for free on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcasting app now.
What do you like about this game, and what does it do that you wish more video games would do?
I like the fact that it's really is trying to be its own thing. I just feel like a lot of games aren't necessarily bringing anything to the table. They're not like trying to say anything. Like, I like that the narrative in the game is not a power fantasy, really. It's like, at first glance, it is. People are like, oh, I'm gonna totally kill those Colossi, bro. But then you kill that first one and like the music swells up and it's like, wait, am I the bad guy? This doesn't seem good.
Are we the baddies?
And I really, really like that aspect of it, because a lot of narratives are like, they're fine and they can be really interesting, but that was a new experience too, of having that kind of like conflicted but unclear feeling. Because in some other games, if you're not the good guy, it's like, oh no, you are the bad guy. It's like you're not that a good guy. That's fine. It's very, very obvious. But this ambiguity was really, really cool, and I wanted to reflect that in my own game as well.
Yeah. So many games are driven by the act of killing, which is a very macabre thing. And we were just talking about how, shooting things feels so impersonal, like we just feel divorced from the act of doing it in video games. And then sometimes it feels good. Like, I really like the way that an arrow pierces a creature in your game. Like the way when you get a headshot, it's just like, oh, I felt good. That felt really good. But even to this day, we struggle with communicating moral ambiguity in video games. Like, so often it is like, I'm red now, and that shows that I'm bad. Not to diss games that do I'm red now and I'm bad. But with this thing being an art form and so many people trying to depict morally complicated ideas in this medium and trying to catch up or compare itself to film or books and things like that, it is just like, this game, it just feels so natural at being able to use an interactive medium at communicating morally complicated ideas and characters that you don't know are truly good or bad, and just making you contemplate on the experience as you're doing it, while still also like having, like, even the music feels complicated. Like, it's like not just epic and sweeping or scary and overpowering. It's just like everything is in service of like delivering on this complexity.
Yeah, and I really like how they do that in a way that isn't just hinged on having lots of spoken dialogue too, because that is the way that most games would just default to, and I really appreciated that that's not the way they went about it. Because I, generally speaking, like things that don't use that much dialogue. Like, there's this one movie, I'm probably going to completely butcher the way to name it, or to say it, but it's called Koikastani, and it's all set to just music and images of things happening around the world. And in my opinion, it's like an incredibly moving and interesting film. And I think Shadow of the Colossus has that same kind of feeling of like all these things coming together to like express these feelings and ideas without, beating you over the head with it. You have to think about it and see how it feels.
Yeah, I think the natural impulse with an interactive medium is to get really meta with it because you, as the player, are sort of culpable in the actions that you're carrying out. But this game feels so authentic about it. Like when Dorman tells you, like, hey, it is very much possible to bring your loved one back to life. That is possible. You have to kill people to do that. Furthermore, this will come at a great personal cost to you. At no point is Dorman, who could in a lesser experience be considered a trickster god or a liar or like telling half truths. That would be like something that would be like, well, that was a lie. That was trickery. But like Dorman's like, this is how it's going to be. And then your player character is like, okay. And then from that point on, you are in control of Wander in carrying out what you were told. Just because he uses like Dorman has like a shadowy like visage and everything like that doesn't mean that like, oh, it's like that kind of dishonest evil. Nope, it is just outright like, here are the stakes, off you go.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate the honesty of that.
Yeah, and then it's like it's up to you as the player to carry that out. And a thing that just like really resonates with you throughout this experience is like everything feels alive without it needing to talk to you. Dorman will talk to you. That's it. But the Colossi behave in a way that is so different from how other non-player characters just behave in video games. It feels like a living being, not just because of like it having eyes that like pierce into you, but just because like the way it moves and behaves and like has a passive and aggressive state, the noises that it makes, the music that accentuates like the feeling of combating this thing. It just feels so lifelike.
Yeah, and the way they can like interact with the environment is like very sophisticated. It was definitely like a step up from a lot of the way things behaved in games at the time.
Yeah, like I think if there's one thing that should always feel impressive, no matter how far along we've gotten in video games, it's just like how like lifelike everything is on a behavioral level in this game, just beyond like the actual graphical fidelity. Just God, how do they do that? But also aggro, your horse that you're riding on throughout the game. Again, this is the thing that made me frustrated reading all these comments where it's like, the horse sucks to control. I wish the horse didn't suck so much to control. And then I'm like, well, what's the game? Because even your horse has agency in its actions. It is a loyal steed. It will go in the general direction that you wish to go because it loves you and trusts you and you're its owner. But it's also like not going to inherently obey everything that you make because it is a living being that makes its own decisions. Just like a cat isn't going to obey you just because you are its owner, or even a dog that is well trained isn't going to obey you. Everything about this game is communicating to you that everything is alive and has a mind and can think and can breathe and has its own life to it.
Yeah, that's very much how I took the controls. I always thought of it as that you're not controlling the horse, you're like guiding it, you're suggesting it. And that's definitely how it felt to me.
You are Wander on the horse, telling it to go faster, please, or turning the reins left or right and forward and backwards to, encourage it. And I just love how like you try and lead aggro in a direction that doesn't make sense. And he's like, what are we doing? Why are you doing this? I don't want to go over. I don't want to be near that cliff. That's where you fall and get hurt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that feels very natural to me versus some cases where people complain about controls. And I would actually agree. Like The Witcher, great game, don't get me wrong. But you're like, I'm trying to pick up that potion. You're just like, and that doesn't feel great to me. But the way the horse feels in Shadow of the Colossus feels very natural to me.
Yeah, it's natural. That's a great word for it. And the thing is, like, I don't find the horse difficult to control once you like get attuned to it. Maybe I just benefit from having played the game multiple times, but once you get the realization, like, oh, I can just hold down the speed up button. I think it's X or triangle. I can't remember which one. And aggro will just naturally follow the forward path. Like if there's a dirt road, it'll stay on a dirt road that kind of winds around. Whereas like any other video game, it would just be a complete straight line. Aggro will slow down in rougher terrain because it would be weirder to maintain that speed on rough terrain. It just feels so natural. And the thing is, like, it's actually helping you stay on the path. So if you just have this sort of symbiotic relationship where you learn to trust your horse, you will actually get to your destination in a way that doesn't actually require as much input as you would if it were like a thing where it's like, actually, you're controlling the horse. And if you go left, you go left. And you go right, you go right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an important part of how that all plays out later, too, to have that sort of relationship with the horse.
Yeah. I'm going to welcome spoilers from this point forward, by the way, so we can just sort of move forward on that. Because, yeah, I do agree, because when you are on the way to the final Colossus, you basically force aggro to make a jump that it wouldn't have made of its own volition. But again, that love that your horse has for you makes it take the leap of faith. And it doesn't take it. You make it, and aggro uses basically tosses you forward so you save yourself, because again, loyal to you. But aggro doesn't make it. Aggro falls, and it is a tragedy.
Yeah, and I think that wouldn't have the same impact necessarily. Like, I did not care about my horses in Zelda at all. I'm pretty sure mine were just called asshole. And I was just whatever. I just abandoned it all over the place. It didn't matter to me at all versus the way it felt in Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah. I do feel like the way that horses control in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom do take influence from it, albeit in a more gamey way, where you can literally see horse meter, like you did in the older Zelda titles when you had explicitly Epona that you rode. But the way that the horses bob and weave, to express that this is still a wild creature that you have tamed for your use, that is still taking influence from that. Similarly to how Red Dead Redemption 2 uses horses and builds your relationship with your horse during a critical moment in that game that takes almost directly from Shadow of the Colossus. Those emotional moments that you have with your horse would not have been possible had a completely different game 13 years ago from a different studio not been made.
Yeah, and I would also say that Shadow of the Colossus is much better as a cohesive experience with how the horse works with the game. It's very clear that the world is designed with that in mind, and there's all those paths. But I mentioned abandoning my horse because, Zelda, those games are all about climbing up these things, and there's so many places where you're well, I can't take my horse there. I'm going up this cliff. Bye. And there's lots about those games that works well, and I really like their systems and everything. But it's definitely not one cohesive thing. There's a lot of systems at play there, and they don't, in my opinion, always work out in a way that I particularly liked. I would just not use that horse, and I didn't want to bother getting it back or finding a way to bring it around. But that's never a problem in Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah, I like that there are horses and horses stables in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but especially in Tears of the Kingdom, the inclusion of horses almost feels well, they were there and we had them.
Yeah. How about you build a giant mech instead or whatever?
Yeah, you can build a Toyota Camry if you want to instead, if that's how you would prefer to get around. It's there if you want it. And like you said, the design of the game, it's promoting verticality. So if you're moving upwards, then what is the purpose of a horse? Unless it's a Skyrim horse where it can sort of climb a mountain if you're able to play with the engine enough. No offense.
Yeah, those horses are famous for not obeying the laws of physics.
Yeah. And we love them for it. It's just again, what is your game setting out to do, and what is its relationship with space? And as much as the research of Shadow of the Colossus is them being well, with Eco we did design by subtraction, and with this we're kind of deliberately going bigger. Every mechanic and function is so lovingly put and deliberately made where, yes, when it's time to leave aggro behind to do certain things, I'm going to fight a water one now, so why would I bring my horse with me to this arena, or I have to climb this cliff now and aggro can't come with me? The way that the world is built, to your point, and the stuff that you have to do emphasizes the loneliness of having to face some of these creatures alone. It feels so intentional, and it also adds dramatic stakes when you are fighting a Colossus with aggro.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the way some of those encounters work would just be completely different with or without the horse.
Yeah, the way that aggro, even when you're not riding this horse, it just has a life of its own where it's running around the field trying to avoid the Colossus, but also yelling to you and appearing on the screen as you're doing something else. It just has a life of its own, and you will call to it sometimes if you need it for something, and the horse will just be no dude, no, I'm not going over there because I'll die. Love you though, good luck. God, we could do 2 hours on just the horse. But we haven't even talked about the Colossi in much detail yet. Do you have a particular favorite boss battle, or just a favorite Colossi in general for whatever reason?
I really like that one, the big bird one. That one is very fun to fight and just really intense, and it was just technically impressive to me at the time in all ways, and works really well with the horse and trying to keep up with it or avoid it to get onto it. I just thought it was an incredibly interesting encounter.
It feels like one of the most iconic to me because of The first 4 are very grounded creatures. They're very massive creatures. And this one is a little bit smaller, but still very large. And it is taking you into the air with it. And while it is one of the easier boss battles in the game, in my most recent playthrough of it, I didn't even fall off of it. I was able to do it all in one fell swoop. It just still felt incredible seeing the speed represented on it and like dangling onto the wings and feeling like it was a life or death situation, even though I did have a pretty good grip on the thing.
Yeah, and just like the motion of the wings and everything is just super cool.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of those other ones before it are really cool. Like I really like the one that has like the giant sword that's super tall. That one's cool, but it doesn't have the same interest in the way it's acting and moving that the bird does to me.
Yeah. I know that people are frustrated by some of the Colossus battles, or like there are frustrating ones. The fourth one is the one that gave me the biggest trouble because I had to wait just a little bit for it to like look down into the hole. If you remember which one that one is.
Which one is that one?
It's the bunker one. Like it's the field that you have the bunker that you have to go underneath, and it's on 4 legs, and like you have to hide from it for a little while, and then you have to trick it to look into the bunker. But I forgot that you have to be really patient and sneak around with the slow moving sneak to actually get up.
It's definitely a spectrum of difficulty in that game. I wish I had time to play all through 16 before the episode also shipping a game. Generally, I haven't crunched on this game, but like leading to ship, there's a lot going on as a solo dev.
Yeah, I mean, you are publishing the game yourself as well, right? Yeah, that is something that a lot of people, even if they are solo devs, they have like a publisher, and you are doing your own promo, so I can understand how demanding that can be on your time.
Yeah, I totally get why people do that, because some people are like, oh, I don't want to do the marketing stuff, it's super boring, but I actually always kind of liked doing that stuff also, and it can be a nice break, and it's gone pretty well for me. I'm happy with that.
This is our first time talking to face-to-face, and you feel very sociable for what it's worth, so I just think that you have a natural gregariousness to you.
That's good to hear.
But yeah, no, congrats on the solo publishing thing. It's like you're overcoming your own Colossus, and it's one of the easier ones.
Also have to sell fewer copies that way. Though debatably, then it's harder to sell those copies.
Yeah. It's like a difficulty thing where you have to sacrifice one thing for another thing. But at least you're in control. It's like a power fantasy being a self-published person.
Yeah, because I've definitely been on the other side of like that publisher and developer arrangement, and there are publishers that treat people well and like give them plenty of freedom, but I've seen a lot of cases where it does not go well. You're very directly told what to do or how to do it or when to do it by, and it's nice to have that freedom to be like, this is what I want to do, and I'm just going to make up my own schedule, decide what to do. If I want to take time off, I can take time off. Like, I made deadlines for myself, but like, honestly speaking, those are completely made up.
I really admire like the commitment you have to making this, experience where like you're in complete control from beginning to end, and you're holding yourself accountable to getting that task done. And it's this thing where it's like you went solo for a reason, and you're seeing that through. So you do only really have to answer to yourself. And I think that really comes through in like the principles of you making this game. And I'm really glad that you're having a good time with the publishing thing, because I, as a person who actually has a marketing major, hate that part of it.
I mean, it's terrifying. There's like 3,000 games a year on Steam, maybe more now. It goes up every year.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of competition.
Yeah. Being you, that's great marketing. Just saying. Are there any parts of this game that you get frustrated by or wish was done better? I know that we've basically called this game functionally flawless, and like a lot of its design principles pretty intentional, but what about you?
I mean, there is that, what is that one resource that you can collect to improve your stamina a little bit? Is it the little lizards, right?
The shining lizard tails.
Yeah, I kind of wish those weren't in there, because it's not as bad as a collectible, like you mentioned, the coins thing. Like, I don't like stuff like that at all, where it's like, oh, find the 100 pigeons in GTA or whatever, or the flags in Assassin's Creed. It's like completely pointless, and it's just there.
Give me 10 Bs for a quarter,
Yeah, I don't like that stuff. So, but it at least has a function. But I mean, I'd be okay skipping it.
Mm-hmm. And what I like about that is that it's completely optional.
It is. Like, you can. It's just one of those things. It's like, you can skip it, but it is going to be easier if you don't.
So this is a long-winded thing, so bear with me here. But what I read during my research for this, and I never realized this, is that apparently the PlayStation 3 version of Shadow of the Colossus is harder than the PS2 version or the PS4 version, because in maintaining And there's discussion about this. One argument is that it's because it's based off the PAL release, and another version is like it's because it's at a consistent 30 frames per second that your grip is sort of unstable when you're on top of the Colossi, even though you do have your full stamina. And I remember struggling a lot more on the PlayStation 3 version, which is like, thought, am I just a god now that the PlayStation 4 version is easier? But apparently there's an actual stated thing that the PlayStation 3 version's harder because of how the grip works on that, and you're thrown around a little bit more.
This does not surprise me because I don't know if you know this, but like Skyrim's physics is like heavily frame rate dependent too. So people are like, oh, I increase the frame rate cap, and then like physics goes nuts and stuff. Lots of engines have these issues where if you don't have inconsistent timing, you run into problems like this.
Yeah. So you said it better than me, and you being a developer with like understanding of engines. Yeah, that's what it is. But for that one, I did go out of my way to get the Shining Lizard Tails because I needed more stamina for stuff like that, where like I'm being thrown more. But in the PS4 release, I didn't need to do that. And I was kind of glad not to do it because like it's completely optional. Like there's a Shining Lizard Tail on every shrine. And if you get the lizard, you get a negligible, but it is in fact a stamina boost. You get more stamina slaughtering a Colossi than you do killing a lizard, go figure. But I do like that it's in there, not because it's like another thing to do, but just because like this is this other thing where you can get more stamina that you can use to make yourself better at killing, but it requires more killing. And the outcome is so negligible that it's probably not even worth trying to get your fucking bow on to hit that fucking lizard.
It's true.
Yeah.
I think it's like the natural gamer tendency to like want to min-max everything. And like, I'm going to max out my stat and get all these things.
Yeah. There's things where like Team Eco's more than willing to like recognize the gamey version of their thing. Like where there's a 2-player mode in Eco if you beat it in the PAL release or in the HD version, where like the whole game is about like the relationship between you and the girl that you're guiding along this castle. And there's stuff like, oh, there are unlockables in Shadow of the Colossus. If you like do the time trials in the hard mode, like there are additional rewards that make and reward replayability. With all that being said, collect some coins to get another sword in the re-release. It's just this kind of thing where it's like that doesn't feel in spirit with how the rest of this stuff is shaken out in the past, because it's a collectible and you have to get all of them. That's too many pieces. But I like the way the Shining Lizard Tails work because it feels very much in conversation with the rest of the game's themes.
That's fair. And even if I say it would be like the thing that I cut. It's not like I think it ruins the game or anything. Like I was fine with it. It's just like you have to pick one thing.
No, I'm glad you brought it up because that perspective is totally valid and I totally see that. Yeah, this is a game where it's just very difficult for me to think of things to critique because every piece of this feels in service of another part of it, where like the frustration is part of the point. It shouldn't feel totally good and totally powerful on part of the player to enjoy the killing so much.
Why did you come here? Well, I'll tell you then. You enjoy the killing. That's why. What? Are you denying it? Haven't you already killed most of my comrades?
That was...
I watched your face when you did it. It was filled with the joy of battle.
You're wrong.
There's a killer inside.
God, it's just such a good game.
I wouldn't make the map smaller or anything like that, too. Because I could see some people who were like just impatient or whatever. Like, oh, you're not doing anything. Like the journey and getting there, it's all part of it. Like the word contemplative has come up a whole bunch on this. And that's very true.
Yeah, like I like that the game is totally quiet when you are in the overworld, and it's just like gives you space to think. And while some people would use like, oh, I'm going from one part of the open world to another part of the open world, I better listen to a podcast or listen to the in-game radio or something like that. It just feels like a betrayal to do that in Shadow of the Colossus because like it's a deliberately immersive top to bottom experience, and how quickly you want to get to the next objective is totally up to you.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that you don't see in games enough, having like those contemplative moments. Like the only thing I can think of off the top of my head is like in Life is Strange, you can sit in certain spots in the game and it'll just like cut between some cameras and play some music. But I've always been a big fan of stuff like that. And some movies that some people would consider like painfully slow, I really, really like that have moments like that, like the movie Stalker.
Mm-hmm.
It has a lot of stuff like that where it's just like sitting there raining, and it's phenomenal to have those moments in games.
Yeah, I mean, that Stalker's a great shout in terms of what vibe and atmosphere this movie is achieving, because this game does feel like the video game equivalent of a Tarkovsky film. Like, it's very, the languid pace of a lot of the stuff and the quiet nature of it to contemplate is so deliberate, and to put that in an interactive space where like everything is about every other game is so like committee designed to be like, what is engaging the player in this moment? We don't want them to turn the console off. And then this is one that respects the player so much, where it's like, here's the world. You're not even going to like engage in 100% of it. You can like go out of your way to find parts of it that you wouldn't find if you weren't actively. There's parts of it that like have no arena for Colossi or any of the Colossus, and you can just go there if you want to. But if you don't want to do that, you don't have to do it either.
Yeah, it's a very different experience from playing something like the Far Cry games. Like, I've had a lot of fun with those games, don't get me wrong, but you go like 10 seconds maybe, and then like some dude in a Jeep comes careening over a hill firing a rocket launcher. It's like, they don't want you to ever be bored.
Right. Like, have you ever played Far Cry 2?
I have, and that is obviously like a very completely different game, far more like systems heavy, and does a lot of things that some players don't like, but it does a lot of really interesting things, like the malaria system.
Yeah. Like, it's a survival game, and the other games feel like the Far Cry 3-4 definitely take a different approach, because this like 2005 to 2008 or 9-ish area where we're all just trying to figure out like what games are going to be. Like, Resident Evil 4 comes out in 2005, Shadow of the Colossus comes out in 2005, Dead Rising is 2006.
Oh, I love that game.
That's going to be the next episode. But like, it's like, playing Dead Rising was so interesting because it's like, oh, we still don't have a standard yet. So games are just like using these 3D spaces and like very different approaches. And the same company that published Resident Evil 4 is still doing something different with 3D spaces before like the over-the-shoulder 3D kind of thing takes over. And then the universal standard, not universal standard, but like the generally agreed upon principles of like navigating more open spaces shapes out. So it's just really interesting seeing like Shadow of the Colossus going like, well, not everything in a game needs to have something to do. We can just like create an area for the sake of like giving the player something to do other than kill. Or in, Far Cry 2, it's like, what if this big open space was a threat to you and you had to survive it and you could like treat yourself? And Dead Rising, even though like it does have like moments of empowerment, it is like literally every square foot of this is like head to toe zombie. How do I navigate my way through this?
Yeah, that game is wild and over the top. And honestly, all of these like questions and solving it is part of why I went into games in the first place. Like, the first game I played was Pong.
Mm-hmm.
We had no color, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So to see the medium evolve from just those little paddles to all the way of what we have now has been fascinating. And to me, it was always very obvious that was going to happen. Like, I remember arguing in grade school with people like, games are never going to be photorealistic. That's completely impossible. Computers can't do that. I'm like, obviously that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we're not necessarily like photorealistic, but we're pretty close.
We're close. Now the conversation is it worth it to do that?
That's
or should
true.
we just focus on making a game?
I was going to say, I would say my game itself is sort of a reaction to that, where I obviously quit a giant 500-person company to go make a solo indie game.
Mm-hmm.
And even if I am using a bunch of like fancy Unreal bells and whistles, clearly I'm not going to do as much as 500 people.
Right. Yeah. But like, it streamlines your experience to be like, as massive as your world is, you have priorities with it, and you're not just trying to like make it fillery. As much as we love the games that were influenced by Shadow of the Colossus, this is a game that's like so deliberate with every single choice that it makes, whereas other games are like, we incorporated this mechanic from Shadow of the Colossus, but it's not in service of the same theme. It's just like, it's here, and then there's all this other stuff, and it's like, oh, there's just a lot more scope in this project and a lot more scale to everything, and you borrowed that, but it's not really in conversation with the rest of the game. It's just like, I don't want to say superficial, but it is just this thing where it's like, it's cool that this game is so mechanically inspirational. And there are other games that really deal with like tragedy and melancholy in the wake of it. this game just feels like in a vacuum. So like the studio just had faith, the Sony just had faith in this thing, and it became successful and built a legacy because it was so singular, and we just don't have that space anymore.
Yeah, it can be really hard for studios of that size to be able to justify a project that is like pretty risky like that.
Yeah.
It's part of why the indie space is nice.
Yeah, like we can fund a 1-for-1 remake of Shadow of the Colossus because that is a legendary game that made us a lot of money originally. But we can't fund like what the next Shadow of the Colossus could be in a conceptual sense. We can't fund a new boundary pushing thing because we're just reacting to trends, and then the thing comes out 4 years after the trend is even relevant, and it's just like the snake eating its own tail, which is coming back to the whole like, should we prioritize being photorealistic when like that time could be spent refining and exploring mechanics that could be used in new and exciting ways that could be iterated on in different other games?
Yeah, and frankly, you're going to end up closing more and more studios doing that because it is so extraordinarily expensive and labor intensive to do everything to that level of detail and do that much stuff. Like, It's no surprise to me that a lot of these places have closed. It's a huge bummer, and I feel bad for all those people. But when you see some of these team sizes for the games, you're like, that is too many people. Like, that's so much money. Mm-hmm. Hundreds of millions of dollars in a lot of cases.
Yeah. I even said the number of people that worked on this game was 35. 35 people to make Shadow of the Colossus. That was a big project in the PlayStation 2 era, and it was one section of Japan's studio that produced, again, a game of this magnitude that was impacting some of the biggest sellers of all time, like Breath of the Wild, and has helped Sony along the way with games like Horizon Zero Dawn and Forbidden West. But they just don't have an experimental division anymore. Like Team Asobi was part of Japan's studio, and that's kind of like the one place keeping that stuff alive. But we don't have a studio developing Gravity Rush anymore. We don't have like a Sony internal division that's making the Demon Souls stuff anymore. They're just counting on third-party people to do that now, while like they just fund like the next AAA Days Gone or whatever.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but at least there's a lot of games coming out, and the tools have improved a lot. So I think it is possible to make a lot of really interesting things without as large of a team these days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, indies are the future, which is why I'm interviewing you. But yeah, can you speak to more of the stuff that's like influenced your, specifically like what's parts of Shadow of the Colossus like influenced you on the Axis Unseen specifically?
Sure. Yeah, I mentioned that the architecture and the way that felt influenced me a lot because I always wanted like a really epic feeling to the game, and that is one of the strongest instances of that, where you have all these like giant structures, and I just like the feel of that. And it also felt like a really approachable way for me to do it as a solo indie, as opposed to this really dense environment of like villages and stuff. Like I have places where people lived in the game, but for the most part, it's lots of large monolithic structures and giant skeletons. And I just like that feeling of like actual scale. Like I've mentioned in some interviews and stuff, it's like, oh, it's like 5 times the size of Skyrim. And people act like that's really big. But Skyrim it's literally like Disneyland, basically. Like it's incredibly compressed, actually. It's not nearly as big as you think it is. It's
dense.
Big. It is very dense because it's all about just getting to the dungeons and stuff. It's very different goals. But I did want actual big stuff. So the mountain in the game is like literally 2 miles tall that you eventually get up to. And it's part of how I wanted to like draw people into the world too. By having these large structures, you're able to do that by navigating just by looking at things, right? So many games rely on you constantly looking at a map. And I like not having that feel. Again, like Shadow of the Colossus, to like really bring you into that world and find other ways to navigate by just looking and using your eyes and like getting a sense for the place, a real sense of exploration that way.
Mm-hmm. Like you have a map in Shadow of the Colossus. You don't necessarily need it. You might like find yourself like, how do I get over this body of water? Oh, there was a bridge I was supposed to cross over here, and I'm on the other side of it because I sort of like only followed the direction of the sword light, and that put me in a general direction. But that happens like maybe 1 or 2 times in the entire game. Generally,
yeah, I feel like
the
you
sword
can almost entirely use the sword.
Yeah, and it doesn't necessarily encourage like further exploration of the world or like developing a relationship with the rest of the world, because that is so emergent. I feel like talking about the difference between the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 experience that I had in the PlayStation 3 one, my emergent role play of Wander was like I need to get my girl back, but I don't have enough stamina. So I have to like find more of these shrines to get more stamina so I can be better at killing these things. And it's like you're exploring the world with a purpose of like, I need to find more resources to better prepare myself. You as the player are like, wow, look at this thing. Wow, look at this thing. I wouldn't have seen this if I hadn't gone on my way to see this. But my role play that emerged playing in the PlayStation 4 version is like, I don't need this stuff. I can just brush past all the architecture and environment stuff and just mainline, make a direct beeline to the next beast, which almost feels equally valid as an interpretation, because this is a guy so consumed with his mission that he's ignoring the world around him and the implications of it and what came before him.
Yeah. And I think there's some obvious parallels there with like the Bethesda games and how it is the complete opposite of that, where this is the guy like on a mission to do a thing. But in the Fallout and Skyrim games, it's like, I'm a person on a mission. What's shiny thing over there? Completely distracted.
Yeah. We talk about like the intentionality and the purpose of everything. Like, yes, Shadow of the Colossus is an open world game, but you can beat it in 5 to 8 hours, depending on how used to the controls you are and like you're just like figuring things out and how much you want to explore what is there, even though like it is a deliberately empty world. Kind of, there's no other people. You're not going to run into another person. It's like, I have a quest for you. Everything you do is on your own time, and how much of it you want to engage with is up to you. But even Breath of the Wild, a game that I think does the loneliness and isolation and contemplation really well, has diversions and side quests and little things that you can discover and people you can interact with, because it's trying to be a 100-hour game. If this person's only going to play one game for the rest of their life, we have to be that game.
Yeah.
So it's like you have things where it's like, yeah, the horses are unwieldy and you can climb things, and those feel like Shadow of the Colossus. But you can also fast travel, and you can make in Tears of the Kingdom like weird little planes if you want to. So it's like they're trying to be everything while also respecting the things that came before it, and to create a mood and atmosphere. While this game is like just so itself, that experience is part of the point, and it doesn't want anything to get in the way of how it's trying to make you feel.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's ultimately a lot more of my favorite game. And I like the Zelda games and had fun with them, but especially with the second one, that kind of stuff is sort of why I stopped playing it. Because I remember actually literally the moment I basically quit, when I found some guy in some well, and he's like, oh, you found me down in this well or whatever. Can you find the other 50 wells or something? I was like, nah, man, I'm out. I'm not going to find 50 wells.
I love Tears of the Kingdom because I feel like that is a game that's a lot more you get out of it what you put into it. If you want to do 50 wells, like that's up to you, but there's not exactly trophies in the Nintendo ecosystem anyway. So I think they just have more of a, look, we put 50 wells in the game. If you want to look for them because you're a completionist, let's torture you over it. But with me, it's like, yeah, whatever. So yeah, I respect that philosophy a lot more than like some, but it's just this thing where it's like, again, this game is just like using the interactive medium of video games in such a minimalist but also grandiose way that makes it feel so compelling. And just like you can show this to somebody, and you don't have to worry about other stuff getting in the way of what the game is trying to do. And you can just really reckon with like the quiet nature of this thing and really soak in like, why is this world so empty? And start asking questions and looking for answers, and like letting the story seep into you, and the dread of watching your character become more and more gray, and the dark veins consuming him as they commit more and more sins in this. It's like you discovered Eden again, and like you found the evil that also resided in this once paradise. It's just so good.
Yeah, and that corruption actually kind of happens in my game as well. And I'm surprised more people haven't noticed it in the trailers and stuff. Because you like start out with a regular hand, right? But as soon as you start getting the powers in the world, like your hand starts to change. And, it's not necessarily a good thing to get all of power. And that's ultimately what my game narrative is about, too.
Yeah, and I appreciate you being somebody who's so influenced by Shadow of the Colossus and being one of the games that's trying to take thematic influence from it, not just visual and mechanical influence from it, because it is interesting seeing your character get more and more marked by that journey, and seeing the tattoos on the hand. That's always like, it's part of your UI and it serves a mechanical purpose, but it also serves a thematic purpose, which again, that mutualistic relationship between mechanic and theme is what makes this game so stand out.
Mm-hmm. And I get questions about stuff sometimes that's kind of funny. People are like, oh man, but I feel bad about shooting that deer monster or that tree guy. Do I have to? Like, I don't know. Do you?
Because we put so much of that into it. Like when I played Elden Ring, I hated killing the deer. Like it would drop a resource and you'd pick it up, and it's like, man, that's like the one thing in this world that's alive that's not trying to kill me. Why'd I do that? Now I'm going to be thinking about that all day. But it is interesting to make that a much more, like less of a texture and more of like a fold in the case of your game.
Mm-hmm.
What else do you have to say about Shadow of the Colossus while we're talking about this?
Just the variety in the way that all the different colossi work, because it is far more than most games with the way that they move about the world and act. Because I feel like a lot of games you play, and even if it has like 10 or 20 enemy types, they're all kind of the same.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to reflect that same kind of thing also and have lots of unexpected behaviors that you wouldn't necessarily have seen before. And like I had a creature in the game that I put in really late. I'd been doing playtesting since like February with a private playtesters, and it took one playtester hours to figure out a creature even existed. And it was right next to them. So I've tried to like put in lots of different ways that things work, basically, to make it interesting. Because I think it can be just be like, oh, the thing runs at you and you attack it. And there can be a lot more that can happen in a game than that.
Of course. We talked about how this game has influenced you as a developer. Can you speak to how you think this game has impacted you as a player or just a person as Nate?
I think it's just made me appreciate more games that are just trying different things. And that was kind of before like the whole indie thing, and has appreciating stuff like that has pushed me more towards seeking out these kind of experiences. And like I mentioned some of these larger games and how I've bounced off of them. And part of that is honestly, I like playing lots of different things that are not sprawling things. Like I have zero desire to play Destiny. Like it's fine if you want to, but I do not want to play a game for like 500 hours. Like I would much rather play a whole bunch of these like shorter experiences that are kind of all over the map. And that's why I really enjoy like when I do the IGF judging, that was like a great excuse to try a lot of games that I honestly would maybe not try even normally.
Mm-hmm.
To just have like this sampling of like what's happening with games as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
And that stuff is really fascinating because it can be lots of really interesting things, even if not all of them are good and I'm going to bounce off plenty of them. Like that's fine. But then you find these hidden gems and you're just like, wow, this is fascinating.
Yeah. If there's one lesson we can take from having you talk about this specific game, it's that, you know, you worked at a company like Bethesda and you left during the development of Starfield. And as I understand, like the reason you left Bethesda is that it was becoming too large and you were used to smaller development teams creating more personal experiences. Even when you were making things like Fallout 3 and things of that, and Skyrim, those were like relatively smaller teams of less than 150, whereas now games feel like they're made by thousands. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely why I left in, but also in my opinion, that small scale is why Fallout and Skyrim like resonate with people to this day. It's because it's not like this top-down designed by committee thing. In my opinion, it was a whole bunch of individual contributors who were all trying to take like their corner of the game and like make something special. Like if you go into some random dungeon in Skyrim, you don't know what you're going to find, right? It could be like this whole sprawling quest line that takes literally as long as some games. And that sort of sense of surprise and discovery and having that agency as a developer was huge in that. Like, I'm sure some people like Starfield and it turned out okay, but I think it lost some of that. And it's really hard to keep that, even just from a sheer production methods level. Like, it's hard to do that with that many people across that many companies.
For sure. I mean, like the thing that struck me about the production of Shadow of the Colossus is like Ueda was involved in basically every step of the production and like the different places with like there's over 30 people worked on this game, which means like different parts like the environment and the writing and everything like that and the actual like art design and everything. Like he was giving feedback on it, and it feels, even though this is a group experience and this is the accomplishment of a group, there is like a unifying voice to it. And so that's not even like giving into auteur theory or anything like that. It's just to me, everybody has a song to sing, and it's hard to be a part of a chorus when like thousands of voices are singing together and none of them are allowed to stand out. Like it's a very unfortunate thing that Rockstar is a company that has multiple studios across multiple countries. And they all used to develop their own game. And that's why they were making games come out every year at one point in the 2000s, because a different studio, a different corner of Rockstar was able to put something out. And now all these corners have to unify into a single game. So they're not even unifying. It doesn't matter if there is like a unifying voice or coordinating project leader or anything like that, because there's thousands of people working on Grand Theft Auto 6. And I'm sure that game will be good. I'm sure I'm going to like it. But it just sucks that it all has to be collapsed into one thing instead of like 8 or 9 tight and dense experiences.
Yeah, like I'm sure I'm going to like the next Grand Theft Auto also, and I've enjoyed them. But Bully, on the other hand, is one of the games that I think is like a super underappreciated gem and is
Agreed.
far more compact and does a lot of really interesting things with time. Like that game is phenomenal.
I would love a Gen Z version of a Bully too. Like I would like to see what that would look like now. Like that was a very like Gen X millennial version of that thing. I'd like to see a new version of that, but we're never going to get that because we get one game a decade now. But that's dunking on current practices and everything like that. Again, everybody has a song to sing, and that was a big takeaway for me here. But there's more to this than just the production of the thing and the presentation of the thing. I just love how it's able to like create like a moral complexity in its world and not have that be like a karma system or like a sliding meter of anything. It's just like you absorbing the story and thinking about your culpability in it without the game ever passing judgment on you. It is just simply telling a story, and you are a part of that. Like you are a player, an actor in a play. Because I think Dorman is a more morally complex character. I think that Mono and that whole like cursed fate thing, like, is that something that somebody ascribed to her, or is that like something that had some weight to it? It is a tragedy that she was sacrificed. It is not fair to her as a human being who has a life of her own to have it taken away from her. But what danger did it pose? We'll never truly know. And that's what makes the shaman character a very interesting thing, where it's like they are functionally the true villain. And Dorman did not attack anybody until Dorman was attacked after it like was resurrected. And notably, like all the Colossi contain a piece of Dorman, and most of them are passive. So these Colossi were like living things, and while they were scary and imposing, they were not aggressive towards you until you did that. And even when they die, it feels pitiful and sad, and they accept it. It's just everything has a fold of moral complexity to it. Even the antagonists and the central force of it. It's just like it feels like a true tragedy in a video game.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's why it can be so compelling, having all those feelings and ambiguity to it.
Yeah, you don't need dialogue to do it. It can just be a feeling, and I think that's why video games are the most promising form of expression in this medium right now. Of all these different forms of media right now, I should say.
I think I have a soft spot for things in general that just don't use dialogue or vocals or anything. Like a lot of my favorite music doesn't have any dialogue. I appreciate things like this without much of it. I think it's also part of just the way my brain works too, where it's easier for me to like just think about it, process it. Like I never liked getting taught to by someone just sitting there talking and stuff like that. I think there can just be so much more interest in how you do things without always doing it that way.
Yeah. We have like a philosophy of like, niceness is what you say, kindness is what you do, right? There's politeness and then there's kindness, and like kindness is action. It's how you behave. It's what you do for others. And then niceness is like what you say. And it's like dialogue and saying things to you. That's all well and good. You can like express the intention of what your art is trying to be, but kindness, the actual act of delivering on the thing, is so much more impactful and meaningful. It's not just pretty words from a politician or PR or a head of a studio. It is like, the actual product, the actual like act, the art itself is just actually fulfilling and delivering on something without needing to constantly look behind itself and be like, you get it? Right? Mm-hmm. Huh?
Yeah, it makes me think of a lot of the environmental storytelling that we did in the Bethesda games, which I think a lot of the people did appreciate too, where there are all like the journals and Pip-Boy tapes and stuff that you can find too, but then a lot of people just really liked all the skeletons posed in my opinion, humorous ways, mm-hmm. where they died, or the teddy bears. That stuff was like super fun to do as a developer, and just the feeling of how you process that as you move through this environment and sort of unpack what happened there is really cool. It's like you're kind of like a detective, right?
Yeah, and that's the kind of feeling that's very consistent in Shadow of the Colossus. Like, this story was already told. My character Wander is just insisting on a new story and is ignoring the omnipresent warning sign in front of your face. And you, the character who is controlling Wander, has just this sense of dramatic irony about the whole thing, but you also want to see it through out of your own curiosity, which is what leads to the culpability of the ending. Like, the happiest ending you can have for Shadow of the Colossus is to never turn it on, but then you lose such a meaningful and impactful story by not seeing the tragedy play out. And isn't that the nature of all storytelling?
Would have been kind of funny if they had something for that.
Yeah, it's
Don't they have that in like one of the Far Cry games? You can like end the game in the first 10 minutes or something. Be like, nah, man, I'm out.
Far Cry 4, I know specifically has a thing where the villain of the game is like Pagan Min or whatever his name is like, wait here, I'll be right back. And then like if you just sit there for 15 minutes, he's like, all right, I'm back. And then like and then he like explains like the plot of like what was all going to go on. It's like, and then that's one of the valid endings of the game. It's just sit there for 15 minutes. I do like that detail. I do like a thing where it's like it gives options for that. Unless it's a tragedy, in which case like the rails are the point. Oh no, we can't stop the trolley.
But it is like the kind of thing that people always think of when you like watch a horror movie too. And then they're always like, man, don't go in there.
Mm-hmm. That's Shadow of the Colossus. Before I move on to the recommendation section, I just wanted to ask you if you had anything else you wanted to say about this game and what it means to you or what you love about it that we may have missed.
I feel like we covered most of it, but like obviously, if you haven't played it, you definitely should check it out. And the other stuff that I talked about too, like Subnautica, there's just so many interesting games out there. You know, support indie devs.
Oh yeah. This is a game that I consider one of my absolute favorites of all time. Like if I have to make a list of 20 games, easily in there. I think that if you're somebody who really wants to see what games can be, and if you're a person listening to this podcast, let's just say that. If you're a person who listens to this podcast and you're capable of playing video games yourself, you have to check this game out however you can, please, because there's nothing like it. It's more than just history in terms of like how it's impacted the world. It is itself just a true work of art that everybody who cares about video games should have a chance to play. I love it. It is just incredible from the design, the atmosphere, the gameplay, the music. It's damn near perfect. But yeah, that's going to do it today for Shadow of the Colossus. A shorter episode, but like we'll call it design by subtraction. Let's not linger. Let's get into the recommendations. At the end of every episode, I like to give the guest an opportunity to make some recommendations based off of the game we discussed. This can be anything from television, film, music, whatever. If somebody likes Shadow of the Colossus, what would you recommend, Nate?
I think I also like sort of what people call the walking simulator genre too, which can evoke a lot of really interesting feelings. Like I really like What Remains of Edith Finch, Firewatch, Dear Esther. All of those are really good games to me that again are like a little bit more focused and respect the player. And even if those aren't for everybody who are like, oh, I want it to be more like a game, I think they do a lot of interesting things, and it's, in my opinion, a disservice to games to assume that they always need to be gamey, and there can be a lot of interesting things going on there.
For sure. I have a few recommendations myself. So one of the big influences on this game, as I mentioned earlier, were monster movies, kaiju films that Ueda watched when they were younger. The composer, Ko Otani, worked on multiple kaiju films, including the Heisei era of the Gamera films, which I recommended previously in the Super Mario RPG episode because Bowser is very much like Gamera. But the trilogy of Gamera movies that he composed for, Guardian of the Universe, Attack of Legion, Revenge of Iris in the 90s, are very much a darker, more contemplative take on like kaiju film. And there are many movies like that. Like I would also extremely shout out the original 1954 Godzilla. It's the 70th anniversary, and that first film is extremely dark and very existential. It does feel like it is actually grappling with like this horrific tragedy that a whole nation is still trying to recover from. But that's not the only kaiju film that does that. Like the Gamera trilogy, which again has the same music as you would get from a Shadow of the Colossus guy, really delves into like the darkness in a not edgy way, but in just like a saving humanity and like what makes it worth saving and what force. Like it needs to be more than just a cosmic force. It has to be people that want to save other people. Just a great trilogy of films. Definitely check those out if you haven't watched any, especially if you haven't watched any Gamera films and you do like things like Godzilla and haven't watched them. So yeah, I would definitely recommend 1954 Godzilla and then that trilogy of kaiju film. Thank you so much for your time today, Nate. I know that you're very busy promoting your game right now, and I want to make sure that people know where to get it and what they can do about it. So please promote the hell out of yourself.
Yeah, so you can get the Access Unseen on Steam. The demo's out now until the 22nd, and any progress you make in the demo carries forward to the full version also. Because then, yeah, it'll launch on the 22nd on Steam in the Epic Store, and I hope you like it. If you want to play a heavy metal horror game where you hunt monsters from folklore.
Yeah, the demo's literally free, so you can check it out yourself and see if you want to play it. I got to play it myself, and I enjoyed quite a bit, and I just recommend that anybody who wants to support indie developers support the one that made time to come onto my show today. So thank you, Nate. It really means a lot that you made time for this. Thank you again for coming onto the show. Thank you for talking about a game very near and dear to my heart, and thank you so much for listening to this episode of Select and Start. Once again, I am your host, editor, and promoter, Keifer. If you enjoyed this episode, please give the show a positive review wherever you're listening to this, because engagement helps the show and your feedback will improve it. If you want to get more engaged, give the show a follow on Twitter at SelectPodStart. If you have thoughts about Shadow of the Colossus or any other games we've discussed, send a DM or leave a comment, and I will gladly read it on the show. You can also support me on Patreon at patreon.com/Keifer's Corner. If you pledge at least $1 a month, you'll get early access to new episodes, as well as extended episodes with exclusive content. That's again on patreon.com/Keifer's Corner. You can find a link to that and the rest of my projects in the description of this episode. Select and Start is on the Moonshot Network, which is supported by its own Patreon. Find out more on moonshotpods.com. The art for the show is made by my best friend Avery Ott. You can follow him on Twitter with the handle at AveryRobinOtt. That's AVRY Robin OTT. The show's theme song was composed by Mike Petrie. You can check out the links in the description for both of their works, as well as Nate's. All right, I think that's it. Raise thy courage to defeat it.
Abro.